tercera sesión plenaria del 44º periodo de sesiones de la Asamblea General, convocada para continuar con el diálogo de jefes de delegación sobre el tema central de esta Asamblea, desarrollo con inclusión social. Antes de ofrecer la palabra a los jefes de delegación, deseo recordarles nuevamente que en la medida de lo posible, las exposiciones deberían ajustarse al tiempo que hemos acordado. Corresponde también informar de que de acuerdo con el registro de solicitudes de palabra que quedó pendiente al finalizar la segunda sesión plenaria celebrada en el día de ayer, en el orden de los oradores será el siguiente: Perú, Barbados, Belice, San Vicente y las Granadinas, Grenada y Surinam. Me complace en ofrecer la palabra a la señora Canciller de la República del Perú. Tiene usted la palabra, señora.
Muchísimas gracias, señor presidente. En primer lugar, mi saludo fraterno al pueblo paraguayo y el agradecimiento de mi delegación por esta generosa hospitalidad, así como nuestras felicitaciones a usted y al gobierno en general, porque ha asumido una gran responsabilidad en organizar esta cálida Asamblea General. Mi país cree firmemente, señor presidente, en el futuro de la OEA y que corresponde a los Estados miembros demostrar en estos momentos su compromiso con los esfuerzos que se realizan dentro de un contexto internacional complejo para que la organización sea fortalecida, se haga más eficaz, concentrando su atención en las tareas que tradicionalmente se consideraron como fundamentales. Resaltamos que la OEA, siendo un espacio privilegiado para hacer frente a los retos que afrontamos los países de la región, a pesar de las críticas, es el foro político por excelencia del hemisferio, por lo que queremos que el proceso de visión estratégica en el que estamos inmersos abone asertivamente al objeto de darle mayor consistencia y futuro a la organización, haciendo que todos los países miembros nos articulemos para que podamos generar espacios de cooperación en los pilares que hemos reconocido como propios de nuestra organización: la democracia, los derechos humanos, el desarrollo y la seguridad multidimensional. En este contexto, señor presidente, el Perú saluda este momento de cambios y quiero ser muy enfática en señalar en esta Asamblea que el Perú acompañará protagónicamente todos los esfuerzos encaminados a la mejora de la OEA. La OEA no solo ha sido y sigue siendo un espacio que ha servido en momentos claves para restaurar la democracia en el continente. Ha sido además una gran promotora y protectora de la democracia y los derechos humanos. Y si hoy la OEA necesita la ayuda de todos los países miembros para superar problemas institucionales que nos exige la América, quiero decirle, señor presidente, que los peruanos estamos aquí para decirle a la organización que estaremos prestos para colaborar en todo lo que sea necesario. Nuestra experiencia, nuestros recursos financieros para el fondo regular, el cual mejoraremos, y nuestros funcionarios ayudarán ahora y más adelante en todo lo que sea necesario. Señor presidente, la elección de la inclusión social como el tema central de esta Asamblea General no ha podido ser más oportuna, al ser esta una de las grandes tareas pendientes de nuestra región. Ya en junio del 2013, el presidente Ollanta, en su visita al Consejo Permanente de la OEA, destacó la importancia que esta organización incorpore la perspectiva de la inclusión social en sus trabajos, por lo que quiero felicitar al honorable gobierno de Paraguay por haber escogido este eje temático al más alto nivel hemisférico, visibilizando los problemas que afectan aún a millones de personas en nuestra América. Nuestra región ha venido disfrutando en los últimos años de tasas de crecimiento que a través de intensas y bien definidas políticas públicas deben servir para cerrar la brecha de la desigualdad. No se trata solo de seguir creciendo, sino de vencer a la pobreza atacando la desigualdad con la articulación de políticas intersectoriales, participativas y focalizadas en la población más vulnerable. Eso el gobierno del presidente Ollanta Humala lo ha puntualizado como la estrategia Incluir para Crecer, que implica que no debemos esperar para distribuir, sino que la inclusión es clave para sostener el modelo y seguir creciendo. Los resultados de este proceso son alentadores. Reflejan que estamos en el camino correcto. En el Perú, la pobreza se encuentra por debajo del promedio de América Latina, habiéndose reducido drásticamente al 23.9%, cuando hace algo más de una década la cifra incluía a más de la mitad de la población. Mientras que la pobreza extrema en la región es de 11.5%, en el Perú es de 4.7%, una tasa que mejora la meta del 5% que nos impusimos para el 2016. La conjunción de las políticas económicas y sociales del gobierno del presidente Humala está siendo efectiva. Casi 1 millón de peruanos salieron de la pobreza y medio millón de la pobreza extrema durante la primera parte del presente gobierno. Esto continuará estimándose que en la actual administración del presidente Humala, con las actuales políticas en ejecución, alrededor de medio millón de personas saldrán anualmente de la inaceptable situación de pobreza que las afecta. Hoy esto es materia de observación permanente de la banca multilateral y de los países hermanos. Esto nos motiva mucho, siendo un enorme esfuerzo de los peruanos y peruanas. La política de inclusión social del gobierno peruano se centra en poblaciones vulnerables, afectadas secularmente por la pobreza y por la exclusión. Una de estas es la población de la zona rural andina, donde se vienen alcanzando resultados de inclusión social positivos aún mayor al promedio nacional. Se trata de un foco permanente de atención que se configura no solo con programas sociales, sino con una estrategia integral de dotación de infraestructura pública, servicios, mejora de la salud y algo tan importante del cual ya hemos hablado, mejora de la educación. Se enfatiza en el gobierno del presidente Humala también la necesidad de reformas institucionales que alienten la inclusión social. Se trata de un enfoque transversal en diversos ámbitos, como el caso de los discapacitados, a quienes hemos reconocido en una dimensión innovadora con derechos en una ley precursora en América. Pero también se da en otros ámbitos, como la salud, donde hemos apostado por el aseguramiento universal, pero con mayores y sobre todo mejores servicios, infraestructura y equipamiento, y destaca en ello nuestro Plan Esperanza de lucha contra el cáncer para ayudar a los enfermos y sus familias en lo que es prevención del cáncer. La reforma de la educación promovida por el gobierno enfatiza el papel de los maestros en el proceso de inclusión. Ya se encuentran comprometidos con el cambio y estamos en la fase de incrementar las horas de clase, la mejora de los textos y uso masivo de tecnologías. Ello además de asegurar la plena cobertura de educación inicial y primaria. Las escuelas rurales son también un ejemplo de nuestra nueva visión de una educación inclusiva por su cobertura, con un enfoque multilingüista y una alimentación escolar con el programa Jaliwarma, que cubre la alimentación de más de 4 millones de escolares de todas las escuelas públicas del país. Hay un programa muy especial y muy significativo. Es la atención que se le está dando a los jóvenes a través de la creación de un programa de Beca 18 que comprende actualmente a 30.000 estudiantes de escasos recursos económicos que son becados íntegramente por el Estado para los estudios de pregrado en las mejores universidades públicas y privadas del país y del extranjero. Con muchos de los acá presentes ya tenemos convenios para estos intercambios. Ponemos a disposición este modelo de trabajo para poder además acoger a estudiantes de todos nuestros países hermanos de la región. Lo hemos iniciado ya y queremos continuar este trabajo con ustedes. En la atención a nuestros adultos mayores hemos creado el programa Pensión 65, que es una pensión no contributiva para quienes no tienen ningún tipo de prestación y se encuentran en condiciones de pobreza. La inclusión como política nos tiene que dar una tarea esencial: buscar la igualdad de todos. Y ese debe ser también el reto, pues como dice el presidente Humala, no somos la región más pobre del mundo, pero sí somos la región más desigual. Una tarea que conjuga el proceso de desarrollo con inclusión social se da claramente en el enfoque del gobierno del presidente Humala frente a la conflictividad social, que es un tema que también afecta a muchos de nuestros países en la región. Mi país, por muchos años, enfrentó el tema de la inversión con el tema de las poblaciones. Los pueblos se sentían agredidos con la inversión por un mal enfoque en el ensamblaje de entender que justamente la inversión es una enorme oportunidad que tienen los pueblos para poder desarrollarse, respetando sus espacios y sus tradiciones. La inclusión social en el ámbito de inversiones es clave para entender el crecimiento que requieren nuestros países, justamente para llevar más y mejores servicios a la población y para dar contenido real a los derechos fundamentales. Es en esa perspectiva que se inició lo que se ha llamado en el Perú la política de diálogo, la necesidad de que las poblaciones puedan comprender que la inversión trae consigo progreso, ahí donde el Estado tiene presencia y cumple su papel fiscalizador. El incremento de la confianza es clave en ello y una nueva generación empresarial ha venido a sumarse a este esfuerzo, buscando que comunidad, gobierno y empresarios apuntemos todos juntos y unidos a llevar desarrollo a las zonas de influencia directa e indirecta de las inversiones. El resultado de este proceso hoy nos ha llevado en los últimos 2 años a viabilizar proyectos de inversión por más de 20.000 millones de dólares, comprometiendo vastos programas de desarrollo de infraestructura y mejora de servicios a poblaciones generalmente muy pobres y olvidadas en el Perú. Esta estrategia ganadora no desconoce el papel tradicional y apunta a reconocer y respetar justamente los espacios de nuestras comunidades. Por ello creemos que es importante que esta experiencia pueda ser asumida como una perspectiva de trabajo válida en América, en esta época en donde buscamos desarrollo y reconocimiento de los espacios tradicionales. No tienen que ser ámbitos excluyentes, sino que cabe una política de inclusión social también en la inversión. En esa línea hemos planteado una resolución que se ha denominado Diálogo inclusivo para el abordaje eficaz de la conflictividad social en la inversión para el desarrollo integral, señor presidente. Los Estados miembros de la OEA hemos reafirmado en diversas oportunidades que el desarrollo económico social y la protección del ambiente son pilares interdependientes del desarrollo sostenible. En ese sentido, el Perú ha planteado en foros multilaterales y regionales una nueva agenda de desarrollo sostenible e inclusivo para el escenario posterior al 2015, la cual debe abordar también el tratamiento de temas que generan grandes riesgos para nuestra región, como la atención a los impactos negativos del cambio climático. Somos conscientes que además en nuestro hemisferio se encuentran regiones como el Caribe, particularmente expuestas al aumento del nivel de los océanos, uno de los escenarios de alta probabilidad para el panel intergubernamental de cambio climático, en la medida que se continúe con la tendencia prevaleciente de la emisión global de los gases de efecto invernadero. El Perú, uno de los 3 países más vulnerables del planeta, es además un país biodiverso, geográfica y climáticamente variado, que alberga más de la mitad de los glaciares tropicales del planeta. El gradual y progresivo retroceso de los mismos constituye una de las expresiones más dramáticas del impacto de cambio climático en las zonas andinas, por sus graves efectos en el ciclo del agua y de la agricultura en general y esto lo compartimos con países hermanos como Bolivia y Ecuador. Nuestro país ha asumido la responsabilidad de ser sede en diciembre del 2014 de la 20ª Conferencia de las Partes de Convención Marco sobre Cambio Climático, la denominada COP20. La COP20 de Lima va a dar continuidad y espero un gran impulso a esta etapa de las negociaciones que serán cruciales para el planeta y que deben llevar a un primer borrador del nuevo acuerdo climático a ser suscrito en el 2015. Mi delegación ha propuesto también a los Estados miembros un proyecto de resolución en el que los países de las Américas apoyan el diálogo y la cooperación hacia y durante la COP20, con el que se brinda además el respaldo al gobierno del Perú como presidente entrante de la conferencia. Quiero agradecer realmente con todo corazón la excelente disposición de los Estados miembros de la OEA por el apoyo a esta resolución, lo que contribuye a que nuestra región exprese su más alto compromiso para buscar un resultado ambicioso, incluyente, equilibrado y eficaz en el marco de esta conferencia. Señor presidente, para el Perú, cuya lucha por la recuperación de la institucionalidad democrática en la década pasada inspiró la elaboración y adopción en Lima de la Carta Democrática Interamericana, uno de los instrumentos más emblemáticos de esta organización, la promoción y el fortalecimiento de la democracia ocupa un papel central, tanto como prioridad interna del gobierno que represento, como a través de su promoción en los organismos multilaterales donde participamos. Aspiramos en el hemisferio a una democracia con contenido real, que esté en condiciones de ofrecer a nuestros pueblos resultados efectivos, tanto en la defensa del desarrollo de limpios y transparentes procesos electorales, en el respeto a las libertades públicas esenciales, así como en la eliminación de los obstáculos para la superación de la pobreza, la inequidad y la exclusión. La Carta Democrática Interamericana y la Carta Social de las Américas son los marcos hemisféricos por excelencia para el desarrollo de ese camino, así como instrumentos orientadores para nuestros gobiernos en las iniciativas que desarrollemos. Resultan, pues, indispensable mantener, preservar y fortalecer todas aquellas actividades en que la organización ha demostrado contar con experiencia valiosa de la que se benefician nuestros países en pos del objetivo común de materializar los fines contenidos en dichos instrumentos que apuntan a la consolidación de democracias que atiendan adecuadamente las demandas de los pueblos del hemisferio. La OEA realiza una importante labor de apoyo a nuestros países mediante sus iniciativas en materia de acceso a la información pública o en aquellas dirigidas a materializar la universalización del registro civil y de identidad. La concreción de estos dos valores constituye el objetivo de dos resoluciones que mi delegación también ha presentado. Queremos resaltar también la necesidad de promover las libertades en América y particularmente la libertad de expresión, señor presidente. Nada hay más valioso que el genuino derecho de expresarse y que ello sea respetado de modo real en nuestros países por todos los involucrados en preservar su contenido. La OEA ha entendido esto y el gobierno del presidente Humala saluda que podamos seguir promoviendo esta libertad de cara a consolidar la democracia y el derecho de todos y cada una de los ciudadanos para poder expresar y al mismo tiempo recibir información independiente, plural y veraz que cada vez nos haga mejores ciudadanos. Pero también buscamos una democracia que no sea lesionada en sus bases por la corrupción y una democracia que responda con efectividad al crimen organizado que hoy la amenaza. Ambos fenómenos tienen que tener respuestas firmes y contundentes y requieren además que estemos todos articulados para enfrentarlos juntos, pues configuran fenómenos transnacionales de ruta de dinero y trasiego de delincuentes internacionales que debemos comprender en su magnitud y en ello la OEA tiene muchísimo que aportar. La corrupción es un fenómeno actual y es importante señalar la decisión política del gobierno del presidente Humala de combatirla de manera decisiva. En mi país, en las últimas semanas y luego de meses de arduo y paciente trabajo, estamos procesando judicialmente casos muy graves de corrupción de gobiernos regionales y locales. Si bien puede desalentar a muchos el hecho que estamos todavía lejos de haber desterrado la corrupción, es esperanzador que podamos informar que estamos combatiendo de manera real este problema. El despliegue de esfuerzos de nuestro Plan Nacional de Lucha contra la Corrupción 2012-2016 viene surtiendo importantes efectos y es algo que queremos resaltar como una buena práctica, siendo que la nueva dinámica de combate a la corrupción ha comenzado a ser efectiva cuando se definió esta estrategia. A todos nos afecta en la región también el crimen organizado, otro fenómeno contemporáneo en nuestros países. La respuesta frente a este fenómeno en mi país es intensa a través del combate al narcotráfico, al terrorismo y a los fenómenos delictivos contemporáneos. Hemos avanzado mucho, hemos emitido por primera vez una ley contra el crimen organizado que busca aportar con herramientas eficaces desde el Estado instrumentos para luchar contra este. Hemos expedido una precursora ley de lavado de activos que no requiere el descubrimiento de un delito precedente para su investigación. Hemos emitido también una nueva ley de pérdida de dominio y es un tema que nosotros creemos, señor presidente, que debe ser abordado también por la OEA. Señor presidente, sin lugar a dudas, uno de los temas en los que esta organización juega un papel primordial con un impacto real en la vida de los y las habitantes de las Américas es el de los derechos humanos. El sistema interamericano de derechos humanos ha sido ahora y en tiempos pasados un garante fundamental para la recuperación de la democracia en la región y es un referente a nivel internacional en la materia. Deseo reiterar el absoluto compromiso en mi país con la defensa y protección de los derechos humanos y su pleno respaldo al fortalecimiento del sistema interamericano de derechos humanos. Sin lugar a dudas, el sistema es perfectible y tiene al frente muchísimos desafíos. Estos ya se han discutido en el proceso de reflexión que va a continuar. El Perú considera que este debe acompañar a los países miembros en sus esfuerzos para la protección y la promoción de los derechos humanos. Señor presidente, la proyección futura del conjunto del sistema hemisférico dependerá también de su capacidad para adaptarse a un nuevo paradigma multidimensional de la seguridad. La relevancia de esta concepción para la región tiene relación con su condición de ser una de las más inequitativas del planeta y de exhibir una débil institucionalidad, un contexto que funciona como sustrato para la mayoría de estas amenazas. Nuestros países comienzan a reconocer que las amenazas de seguridad pública alcanzan el primer rango de su preocupación y que la mayoría de ellas, como el narcotráfico, el terrorismo, el lavado de dinero, la minería ilegal, la trata y la criminalidad organizada, exhiben una clara dimensión transnacional. Estas amenazas pueden terminar erosionando la fibra social e institucional de los países miembros del sistema interamericano y su solución demanda la cooperación regional e internacional. El esfuerzo de la organización y de cada Estado miembro debería orientarse en velar porque las democracias aquí reunidas podamos apoyarnos mutuamente para atender las demandas de nuestras poblaciones en seguridad pública y ciudadana y de disminución de la violencia, especialmente de aquella que afecta a los sectores más vulnerables. No podemos dejar de reconocer que paz y seguridad, desarrollo, democracia y derechos humanos están íntimamente interrelacionados. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Agradezco a la señora ministra de Relaciones Exteriores del Perú por su intervención. Ofrezco la palabra a la señora ministra de Barbados. Tiene usted la palabra, señora ministra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a pleasure to be representing Barbados at the 44th regular session of the General Assembly of the OAS here in Asunción, which is revered as one of the oldest cities in South America and has earned the title the Mother of Cities. I would like to thank you, Mr. President, and the government and people of Paraguay for the very warm welcome that my delegation and I have received since our arrival in your beautiful country. I congratulate you on the excellent arrangements that have been made for the meeting. Let me assure you that you may count on the full cooperation of the Barbados delegation in ensuring the success of this General Assembly. Mr. President, Barbados welcomes the theme, Development with Social Inclusion, chosen by the government of Paraguay. We believe that it encompasses issues of critical importance to the development of the countries of the Americas, and that it is only fitting that it is the focus of our deliberations here. Barbados is a small island developing state with unique and particular vulnerabilities. As a small open economy with a narrow resource and export base, Barbados is highly vulnerable to global environmental threats and external economic shocks. My country has been severely tested by the prolonged and prevailing global economic downturn in safeguarding important gains made over the decades to ensure the well-being of our people. It is our conviction, however, that the wealth of Barbados is in its people, and we have sought to provide the conditions that would spur the inclusive growth and development of our society. Barbados therefore places considerable emphasis on human and social capital development. Our significant investments in education and related services provide learning environments conducive to the inculcation of appropriate knowledge, skills, and competencies among all learners. Major areas of focus are the expansion of early childhood education, the integration of information and communications technology in education, and the enhancement of the quality of education at the nursery, primary, and secondary levels. We recognize, too, the vital importance of technical and vocational education and training in the molding of a skilled, competent, and well-diversified workforce, a key variable for economic growth and competitiveness. In pursuit of this, Barbados is also committed to creating a social policy framework which provides a high degree of social protection to individuals in our society facing risk and vulnerabilities. There is a particular emphasis on the youth, and this is against the background of a long-standing commitment to the provision of compulsory primary and secondary education and free tertiary education. Given the high cost of university education, however, students will now be asked to pay approximately 20% of the total cost beginning in the academic year 2014-2015. Barbados subscribes to the philosophy that healthcare is a fundamental right of Barbadians. Consequently, Barbadian citizens and permanent residents are guaranteed universal access to health services, including formulary drugs provided by the public sector. Increased focus is also being placed on implementing the global strategy on the prevention and control of non-communicable diseases. As a result of these fundamental policies aimed at creating a healthy and educated population and an inclusive society, the government of Barbados allocates the largest portion of its resources annually to education and health. The issue of intergenerational poverty is being addressed through the identification, stabilization, enablement, and empowerment, that is the ISEE Bridge project. It is intended to transform the lives of the poor and vulnerable in our society. It focuses on employment, income generation, education, training, housing, health and nutrition, and family dynamics. We have also prioritized programs for marginalized youth designed to reintegrate them into society. Mr. President, the Declaration of Asuncion places correct emphasis on the issues relating to the eradication of poverty, reduction of inequality, and promotion of social inclusion, access to education, and ensuring health care for all. The Barbados delegation fully supports the Declaration's proposal. We support the position that special attention must be paid to the formulation and implementation of sound economic and social policies through the activities of the various organs of the OAS if we are to achieve deeper economic development with equity. Member states must commit to the observation of democratic principles and human rights as a cornerstone of the social, political, and economic development of the peoples of the Americas. In this regard, the OAS must increase its efforts in promoting best practices, broadening educational, training, and technical assistance opportunities, and creating partnerships for development. Strengthening public-private partnerships to consolidate social protection systems is also required. The Barbados delegation is pleased to see that the declaration gives some focus to the challenges facing the development of small island developing states like Barbados and some countries of CARICOM, and that it encourages member states and the inter-American system to promote actions aimed at achieving the sustainable development of SIDS. The United Nations has declared 2014 the International Year of SIDS, and it is hoped that there be heightened international attention paid to the development challenges facing our countries. Barbados calls for the creation of institutional mechanisms to ensure effective inter- and intra-regional cooperation and collaboration on strategic priorities. Such mechanisms are critical to the development of policies aimed at promoting resilient economies, societies, and people in SIDS. The role of the private sector, workers' representatives, and civil societies in this process cannot be overstated. Mr. President, the OAS is at a crucial moment in its history. The evaluation of its operations and its core functions is thus essential. The current dialogue on the strategic vision of the OAS is therefore timely. The core missions remain relevant. Of importance are the preservation, strengthening, protection, and expansion of democracy, the protection and promotion of human rights, and the strengthening of the inter-American human rights system, the preservation of peace and security throughout the hemisphere, the confronting of threats from organized crime in all its forms, and the integral development of all member states, particularly in the areas of education, environment, social protection, free trade, and competitiveness. Together with our CARICOM colleagues, Barbados supports a focus for the OAS which centers on policies aimed at bringing about economic growth and development in all member states. This will require the strengthening of programs for human resource capacity building and competitiveness through higher education, training, research, and scholarships. This also calls for increased engagement and advocacy with our development cooperation partners and the facilitation of greater trade and investment flows between member states. Mr. President, Barbados values the work of the Inter-American Commission of Women and the important work that the OAS does on women's human rights and on gender equality and equity. We actively participate in the work of the Commission and are represented on the SIM Executive Committee by Senator Irene Sandiford Garner. Like all member states, the issue of violence against women is of great concern to Barbados, and we are committed to the full implementation of the Convention of Belém do Pará, which binds states to act with due diligence to prevent, investigate, and punish physical, sexual, and psychological violence against women. This year's resolution on the convention, which is celebrating 20 years since its entry into force, calls for the adoption of protocols to guarantee that female victims of violence have access to justice. The Barbados government supports this provision. We also support the resolution calling for the strengthening of the SIM and the mainstreaming of a perspective of women's human rights, gender equity and equality in all OAS programs, activities, and policies. Mr. President, Barbados launched a drug treatment court in February of this year. As you may be aware, drug treatment courts use the criminal justice system to address addiction through an integrated set of social and legal services instead of relying solely on sanctions through incarceration or probation. The introduction of this problem-solving court signals the government's commitment to treat the issues of its non-violent offenders with substance abuse problems. And this approach recognizes that people struggling with drugs have a chronic disease that reduces their ability to control their behavior. The government of Barbados and CARICOM are fully committed to working with the OAS to ensure that Haiti continues its recovery from the devastation of the 2010 earthquake. We are very pleased that the Permanent Council has approved in April the Declaration on the Electoral Process in Haiti. This expresses solidarity with the Haitian people and their right to take part in fair and free elections. We urge the OAS to continue to strengthen the democratic and electoral process in Haiti through technical assistance and electoral observation missions. We welcome the ongoing dialogue among the branches of government and other stakeholders to achieve the holding of legislative and municipal elections later this year. As I conclude, Mr. President, it is my honor to inform you on behalf of the Minister of Tourism of Barbados, the Honorable Richard Seeley, that Barbados will host the 22nd Inter-American Congress of Ministers and High-Level Authorities of Tourism from September 3rd to 4th, 2014. We have chosen as the theme tourism competitiveness, an essential component of sustainability, and look forward to working with all member states during the negotiations on the important outcome document. This is intended to set out hemispheric approaches, strategies, and policies on the challenges of ensuring sustainability as we seek to optimize our tourism competitiveness. We also look forward to welcoming all the ministers of tourism of the OAS member states and other delegates to Barbados in September. Mr. President, Barbados values its membership in the OAS. We are committed fully to working with all member states and the organs of the Inter-American system to make the organization viable and relevant in the 21st century, and of course responsive to the needs of its member states. We commit to doing everything possible to ensure that the OAS remains a vibrant, viable hemispheric organ. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you.
Agradezco a la señora ministra de Barbados por su intervención. Ahora doy la palabra al señor ministro de Relaciones Exteriores de Belice. Tiene la palabra, señor ministro.
Let me start off by congratulating you, Mr. President, on your excellent stewardship of these proceedings since we commenced. I would also wish to articulate a special thanks to the Secretary General, the Deputy Secretary General, and the staff of the OAS for the tremendous support they have given to us and Guatemala in our initiative and efforts to try to resolve the territorial dispute that exists between our two countries. We have always found them to be very, very helpful, very, very supportive. And to be candid with you, I don't know what would have happened to us and Guatemala if we had not had the support of the OAS. So I want to put that on records. Their assistance has been invaluable. I am pleased to join my colleague foreign ministers and heads of delegation in the expressions of gratitude and felicitations to our distinguished hosts, the government and people of Paraguay, for the exceptional hospitality and warmth with which all our delegations have been embraced. Qué lindo es Paraguay y su gente. Mr. President, Mr. President, development with social justice is a concept that has, for the most part, been alien to our hemisphere for upwards of 500 years. It was not a development model that commended itself to the Europeans, who began to flock to our hemisphere after the arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492. Those Europeans were not motivated by a desire to develop the native populations they found in the hemisphere. On the contrary, they were, for the most part, consumed with a passion to extract all the wealth and fortune that they could from our region at the least cost to themselves and to repatriate it to Europe. In order to achieve that purpose, they first employed the native populations to extract the wealth. In time, African slaves and Chinese and Indian indentured servants were brought to the hemisphere to do the extractive work. The wealth that was generated was shipped back to Europe, be it gold, silver, spices, or other raw materials. The indigenous workers, the African slaves, the Indian and Chinese indentured servants, the peons and the campesinos were mere beasts of burden in the eyes of their colonial masters. They were not deemed to be entitled to any share of the profits that were generated by their labors. And that view, Mr. President, is the genesis of the practice of development development with social exclusion, which regretfully still prevails in our hemisphere today. However, Mr. President, from time to time in the past, initiatives towards development with social inclusion were manifested in our hemisphere in countries such as Mexico, Guatemala, Venezuela, and Cuba. But strenuous efforts were made to stifle those initiatives, including the actual toppling of at least one government which was embarking on land reform for the benefit of its citizens. That initiative was deemed to be inimical to the interests of a foreign corporation that was engaged in agricultural activities in that country, and an end was put to that program by means of a military coup. Indeed, the dominant attitude of those who have exploited the resources of our region over the centuries, and even up to this present time, has consistently been profits before people. With such a philosophy prevailing in the region, there was no space for a development model of social inclusion to take root. It is therefore no accident that even though some countries in our hemisphere are today leading the world in terms of economic growth rates, and our region as a whole possesses such vast wealth and scientific and technological attainments, our hemisphere nonetheless remains one of the most inequitable in the world. Indeed, while hundreds of millions are said to have been lifted out of poverty over the last decade, hundreds of millions are still mired in poverty, excluded, ostracized, and marginalized from the development process, and doomed to eke out their doleful existence in horrendous conditions in slums, shanty towns, favelas, and even in prisons. Against this backdrop, therefore, the theme development with social inclusion is both timely and appropriate for this 44th General Assembly meeting. And I would wish to commend and thank our hosts for selecting it. Mr. Chairman, our President, I am aware of countries where the model of development with social inclusion has been pursued with great success. These countries include Norway, Finland, Singapore, to name but a few. I would like to urge our membership to examine to what extent we may be able to benefit from the experiences of those countries if we are indeed serious about transitioning to this enlightened mode of development. My own research has left me in no doubt that for us to attain development with social justice, our governments must take a more dynamic role in the generation of wealth in our countries. We cannot rely on the altruism of the private sector to effect a more equitable distribution of the profits generated from the exploitation of the natural resources which God gifted to all of us. To that end, it will be imperative for our government to work closely and respectfully, both with all labor unions and other labor forces, as well as the private sector, in the generation of the wealth of our countries. In Belize, we appreciate that creating economic opportunities for the most vulnerable, reducing poverty, and increasing social inclusion are not outcomes that will spontaneously result from economic growth alone, nor from the normal interaction of societal and interest groups. We understand that these outcomes require dedicated political leadership and strategic interventions on the part of government. They require tremendous capital outlays, strong institutions, including a professional public service, good governance, and the rule of law with a human face. We also need to adopt policies that leave no one behind at the national and international level. To that end, our government has been assiduous in initiating measures to maximize its wealth generation, with which to fund social safety net for our people. And at this time, that net includes the provision of monetary support to elderly citizens, cash transfers, a food pantry program, and subsidies for education at all levels in our society. So President Belize is honored to stand at the crossroads of Central America and the Caribbean, a proud and responsible member of these two families. And from this vantage point, we have discerned the similitude of the challenges facing these two regions in terms of developing our countries, while ensuring that the prosperity is shared by all our people equitably. Belize remains committed to the integration process in these two sub-regions and continues to promote a closer and more integrated relationship between our two regional families. Indeed, we believe that we either integrate and survive together, or we remain singly and perish individually. Belize will therefore take over the pro tempore Secretariat of SICA in July 2014, and from this position, we will endeavor to strengthen and deepen the relationship which exists between SICA and CARICOM and the entire hemisphere at all levels. As I indicated at the beginning, the OAS has had a critical role to play in Belize's own life in its dispute with Guatemala. But we also know that it has played a tremendous role and continues to play a tremendous role in the hemisphere as a whole, with its strategic interventions in education, small business centers, focus on SMEs, sharing of best practices for social inclusion, in its program to alleviate the drug situation in our country, and in fact, in the whole issue of security. We want to thank the OAS for its efforts in these regards and to pledge our support for all its activities and to indicate our own willingness to increase our own contribution to its budget. Belize is committed to a strong OAS and to all the principles it stands for, and is hopeful that the strategic vision review exercise will result in a more agile, stronger, and better funded organization that is more responsive to the people of the Americas, especially the poor and the dispossessed and the socially excluded. We support the strategic vision review, and we support the increase in quotas. We also take this opportunity to recognize the leadership of Mexico, our very near and dear neighbor, especially in its ambassador to the OAS in the strategic vision review process. At the macro level, social scientists surmise that the democratization of the hemisphere and the resulting dynamic interplay of the political and economic actors have contributed to the marginalization of certain groups. If one starts from a position of the base of limited access to resources and limited participation, then it is impossible for these groups to spontaneously become organized and politically active, and therefore influence political decisions that impact on the control and sharing of state resources. If one is not at the table, one does not have a say, and therefore limited resources are seldom destined to these areas and communities that need it most. From this optic, it is social inclusion is in fact a prerequisite for the development of our peoples. Mr. President, I wish to place on record a deep appreciation of government and people of Belize for the sterling work of the OAS Secretary General and staff with respect to the Belize-Guatemala dispute. We also wish to thank the group of friends, especially the donors and partners whose continued financial support has been essential to the upkeep of the OAS office in the adjacency zone. We extend a heartfelt thanks to the European Union, the United States, Mexico, Canada, Turkey, Germany, the United Kingdom, and all other contributors. Finally, to the government and people of Paraguay, I would wish to reiterate our thanks for the very kind hospitality which you have so generously extended to us. I thank you, Mr. President.
Agradezco al señor Ministro de Relaciones Exteriores de Belice por su intervención. Doy la palabra ahora al señor Ministro de Relaciones Exteriores de San Vicente y las Granadinas. Tiene usted la palabra, señor Ministro.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. Permit me to congratulate you on your election as chair of these proceedings, and on behalf of my entire delegation, to express sincere appreciation to the government and people of the Republic of Paraguay for the warmth with which we have been received and the kind hospitality shown. Allow me also, Mr. Chairman, to recognize and pay tribute to the role of Secretary General Jose Miguel Insulza, who has toiled long in the vineyard of integration and development in this region. Unlike Shakespeare's Anthony, I come to praise you and not bury you. But I know that this is your last time presiding over this assembly, and I wish to thank you for the wonderful work you have done. Mr. Chairman, we're gathered here in Paraguay under the theme of development with social inclusion. This cross-cutting and multifaceted theme has profound local, regional, and international implications and provides the OAS with a succinct raison d'etre as it looks to its future role in an increasingly complex and interconnected world. In our local context, St. Vincent and the Grenadines remains firmly and demonstrably committed to the concept of development with social inclusion in both word and deed. We have embarked on a wide-ranging set of transformative policies and programs, including our Youth Empowerment Service Program, it's called the YES program, the Support for Education and Training program, the Home Help for the Elderly, a comprehensive education revolution to expand access to educational opportunity, the revolving Farmers Support Fund, the establishment of a Ministry of Rural Transformation, the establishment of the National Economic, Social and Development Council, and a wide-ranging housing and infrastructure program that supports and connects poor and rural populations in our country. These programs have achieved many notable and measurable successes, including the reduction of indigent poverty from 26% to 3% of the population, the halving of undernourishment from 11 to 4.9%, and the increasing access to secondary school education from 35% to 100% of eligible students. With the cooperation of the government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and other generous partners, we are in the midst of providing laptop computers to every single student attending secondary school, to buttress an earlier effort that placed a laptop in the hands of every single primary school student. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is mindful of the need to pursue a holistic and inclusive developmental path. As the world continues to grapple with the fallout of the global economic and financial crisis, spurred in large measure by yawning inequality and rapacious variants of unregulated casino capitalism, St. Vincent and the Grenadines adheres to a people-centered developmental model, with poverty reduction, educational opportunity, job creation, foreign direct investment, and support for small and medium enterprise at its core. Also, of course, the support of many states around this table, bilaterally and through cooperation and solidarity mechanisms like ALBA and Petrocaribe, has been indispensable. However, our developmental goals and many of those of our sister CARICOM states continue to be stymied by the narrow and misleading characterization of our economies as medium and high income, based solely on a crude calculation of per capita GDP. These characterizations limit access to concessional financing, curtail options for debt relief, constrain tremendously our fiscal space, and make it painfully difficult to build resilience against our extreme vulnerability to an unending series of exogenous shocks. The grave and gathering threat of climate change is but one of these exogenous shocks. For St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the wider CARICOM region, crippling climate events are now an almost annual occurrence. For example, in the space of 3 short hours of unseasonal rains and flash flooding last Christmas Eve, St. Vincent and the Grenadines suffered loss and damage to the tune of 17% of its gross domestic product. The year before that, we experienced an extended drought, which devastated agricultural output. The year before that, in April 2011, floods again caused epic destruction in the most vulnerable parts of the country. And the year before that, in 2010, Hurricane Thomas similarly dealt our country a debilitating body blow. 4 years, 4 climate events, each causing loss and damage with a near double-digit shock to our GDP, all while grappling with the global economic meltdown and its myriad developmental impacts. Given our small size, each one of these disasters, either natural or man-made, is not localized or sectoral, but it is national in scope. The vulnerabilities of our small island developing states are acute and intensifying, and our fiscal space to withstand or build resilience is almost non-existent. In this, the International Year of Small Island Developing States, we head to a September conference in Samoa with the goal of acknowledging the unique characteristics and vulnerabilities of our countries and crafting global solutions to combat them. Such solutions will necessarily involve moving beyond per capita GDP as a measure of economic health, affording opportunities for concessional financing, preferential trading arrangements, and debt relief, supporting adaptation efforts, and making meaningful commitments on climate change. We call on the OAS to support this SIDS agenda in the interest of our people's survival. Mr. Chairman, within the Caribbean, we recognize that social inclusion depends fundamentally on the unambiguous establishment and vigorous defense of basic human rights standards. While we all have our struggles and shortcomings in the pursuit of greater human rights protections, our region has made tremendous strides in recent years. Our recognition of the role of human rights and social inclusion in the developmental process is one of the many reasons that we remain deeply disturbed by the ongoing plight of those thousands of Dominican-born citizens who have been retroactively denied their rights to nationality, identity, and equal protection by the Constitutional Court in the land of their birth. That decision and its continuing fallout, by its very nature, are exclusionary and run counter to the theme of this gathering. While we take note of recent efforts to address the situation, St. Vincent and the Grenadines considers them to be inadequate to redress the scope and scale of the human rights violation, which we consider to be the most urgent such crisis currently affecting our region. We call again for the OAS and all members to engage fully and in good faith to assist in ensuring that this blot on our collective conscience is fully and urgently redressed. Similarly, St. Vincent and the Grenadines supports all ongoing efforts to reform and revitalize our hemispheric bodies, whose mandates include the protection of human rights. The rights to development, housing, education, sanitation, food security, and adequate health care are still under threat in our hemisphere, and our regional bodies must be sensitive and responsive to the need to promote and protect these pillars of social inclusion with minimal interference from those who seek to define our local human rights priorities and norms from far-flung locales. Mr. Chairman, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, like many of the members of this body, was profoundly shaped by the scourge of native genocide and the dehumanizing slave trade, which had obvious and continuing impacts on social inclusion and national development. The wounds of slavery run deep, and many of our modern-day struggles to overcome a host of developmental challenges is directly and inextricably tied to the systematic exclusion and exploitation of our native and enslaved population for the lasting economic benefit of European colonial and slave trading nations. CARICOM has adopted a regional strategic and operational plan for Caribbean reparatory justice and hopes to convene a conference between Caribbean and European leaders, which would provide an opportunity for in-depth discussions on this fundamentally important issue. Our quest for reparations has been endorsed by CELAC, and I encourage the OAS to make a similar recognition of our very just cause. Mr. Chairman, our region has been indelibly scarred by the war on drugs. We have all devoted tremendous resources to various interdiction, eradication, and incarceration efforts, and we shall undoubtedly continue to do so, lest the criminality and societal decay associated with illicit narcotics gain a stronger and more injurious foothold in our societies. However, an unintended consequence of our war on drugs has been the social exclusion of large swaths of our population, particularly many youth who may have been only tangentially related to the organized narcotics trade. Similarly, our policies have marginalized countless law-abiding and hard-working individuals, families, villages, and regions, many of whom had the misfortune of simply living in the wrong part of town. Our shared experiences in this struggle have led to a great deal of soul-searching of late, and a reconsideration of our methods and areas of focus. St. Vincent and the Grenadines has taken note of a number of political, legal, and policy shifts in our hemisphere, particularly in the manner in which states confront the production and use of marijuana. CARICOM has established a regional commission to examine many of these issues, and we welcome an enhanced role by the OAS and the sharing of experiences and best practices among member states with a view to creating more efficacious, humane, and socially inclusive strategies to combat drug abuse. Similarly, the destabilizing role played by the trade in and use of illegal firearms is well known throughout our region. Almost every town in every member state of the OAS has been touched in some way by the senseless killings and palpable fear that accompany the illicit small arms trade. CARICOM played a leading role in laying the groundwork for an historic arms trade treaty last year, and now hopes to host the Secretariat charged with its implementation in Trinidad and Tobago. St. Vincent and the Grenadines urges prompt ratification of the treaty and support for our joint ambition to host this important body. Mr. Chairman, the theme of inclusion must be extended to our hemispheric and multilateral affairs. We are long past the unfortunate era of Cold War polarization and isolation, and we must continue to solidify our regional commitment to fully inclusive dialogue, cooperation, and deeper integration. In this modern context, most of us have recognized the utter inapplicability, impracticality, and indeed illegality of the continuing outmoded embargo against the Republic of Cuba. Similarly, Cuba's full, equal, and unconditional participation in next year's Summit of the Americas in Panama must be assured by this body. Cuba's presence and full participation in that summit is an important litmus test of our shared commitment to inclusivity and sovereignty. Our regional commitment to sovereignty and peace must similarly inform our support for the legitimate and democratically elected government of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, which continues to seek a peaceful solution to criminal violence and instigated unrest. We must also support the legitimate sovereign rights of Argentina in the ongoing dispute over the Malvinas Islands and call for long overdue negotiations with the United Kingdom to commence. Mr. Chairman, the Organization of American States is arguably the world's oldest regional organization. As newer regional groupings proliferate, often with overlapping mandates and memberships, venerable bodies such as this must demonstrate a willingness to reform, adapt, and refocus on core competencies in order to remain relevant. In this regard, St. Vincent and the Grenadines endorses the exercise of crafting a new strategic vision for the OAS currently underway. We believe that the 4 pillars of the OAS, as set out in the Charter, are interdependent and of equal importance. But the necessary and desirable realignment of tasks and priorities must remain true to the OAS Charter, which places strong emphasis on development. The goal of this exercise is not to ensure the survival of a mutable and evolving bureaucracy, but rather to guarantee the continuation and enhancement of meaningful programs and activities that touch the lives of our citizens. Mr. Chairman, according to the World Bank, social inclusion is central to ending extreme poverty and fostering shared prosperity. Social inclusion is both an outcome and a process of improving the terms in which people take part in society. The OAS must make this journey and destination of social inclusion central to its identity and focus going forward. In doing so, this body, whose roots stretch back 125 years, will be well positioned to help shape the growth and development of its member states for the next century and well beyond. I thank you for your attention.
Agradezco al señor ministro de San Vicente y las Granadinas por su intervención. Ahora doy la palabra al señor ministro de Grenada. Tiene usted la palabra, señor ministro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, hermanos y hermanas. Mr. Chairman, Grenada takes this opportunity to thank our hosts, firstly, the nation of Paraguay, for their generous hospitality. This began even before we disembarked the aircraft, and it is a hospitality that has continued as we enjoy the warmth, friendliness of the people of Paraguay, and also the extraordinary professionalism of the organizers. Mr. Chairman, we meet here today at a special time in the arc of the international political history. We find ourselves in an unfamiliar, multipolar world with shifting geopolitical realities unfolding on a daily basis. Today, history is being created, not just by state actors, but now also by empowered youth that are educated and connected to the information highway. It is a time when democracy itself is being manifested 24/7 through Twitter, Facebook, and other social media. I start with this to express the view that education and electronic communications are now the foundations for a new and socially inclusive paradigm for development, democracy, and human rights. I say this to emphasize the integrated nature of the 4 pillars of this institution. Indeed, we believe that the principle of development with social inclusion is a cross-cutting theme that underpins democracy, human rights, security, and the development, and must therefore become one of the main guiding principles for organizing the vision of the mission of the OAS. Mr. Chairman, one of the first things to note is that Latin America and the Caribbean did relatively well in the preceding decade. According to the World Bank, the middle class expanded by 50%, from 103 million to 152 million. Moreover, by 2011, the region was able to halve the number of people living in extreme poverty. Some 70 million people were lifted out of poverty. Despite these admirable gains towards greater equity and social inclusion, the income gap in the region remains one of the highest compared to other regions. The World Bank estimates that in order to close the income gap by 2013, in line with other regions, Latin America and the Caribbean would need a per capita growth rate of 7.5% per annum. We learned this spring through another World Bank report on international flows to Latin America that the region may only grow by 2.3% in 2014. This is troubling. Citizens in the region have come to expect a certain level of growth, such as 5 to 6% growth rates experienced a decade earlier. Without the requisite growth, it is likely that jobs will be lost and the social inclusion and social cohesion will suffer. This will have a considerable impact on minors under the age of 17, given that they constitute around half of the poor in Latin America and the Caribbean. Low levels of education is a prominent characteristic of both minors and adults living in poverty in the Latin America and Caribbean region. Moreover, we know that there is a major inequality in the access to quality education across the hemisphere. This is a tinderbox for the explosive growth of the drug trade. Mr. Chairman, permit me to further expand on this matter of education in the context of development with the social inclusion. Our understanding of the economic development and growth has evolved over the years through the work of the French economist Thomas Piketty, highlights that while income is derived from work and from capital, the two are by no means equal. And the growth in income by those with capital is one of the defining characteristics of the inequality we see in today's world. Fortunately, capital is also generated by ideas and innovation, and both are dependent on quality education. So, while it is essential that we continue to push for favorable trading arrangements, particularly for developing countries in the region, this alone is not enough. We must push for greater access to quality education for all of our peoples. Quality education for our peoples in the hemisphere must be a central feature of our call for development with social inclusion. Quality education for all, especially if underpinned by modern electronic communications, must be seen not merely as wealth redistribution, but more importantly, as a critical investment in competitiveness. This is critical if our industries are to deliver the growth which we can help close the income gap in our hemisphere. Quality education for all is a foundation of innovation, and innovation, along with integration of our markets and the development of institutions and the rule of law, complete the 3 I's of the development, growth, and social inclusion. Clearly, if these are not addressed, we are locked into a low-growth scenario, where the drug trade and violence could pose increased security risks to the region and could ultimately undermine human rights and democracy. Mr. Chairman, development and social inclusion must not only be seen in the context of education and electronic communications, but also in the 3rd E, environment. Climate change has a disproportionately negative effect on the poorer countries of our region, and also upon the disadvantaged sectors of society. In particular, those of African descent, indigenous peoples, women, and children. Climate change also erodes the natural capital base for our future generations. This is problematic. In this hemisphere, products and services from our natural capital base contribute to significant sectors of our economy. In the case of Grenada, for example, our tourism relies on our coastal and marine resources, but coral reefs are threatened by sea temperature rises. In 2005, for example, due to high sea surface temperatures, some 30% of Caribbean coral reefs were destroyed or damaged by coral bleaching. This undermines tourism jobs and food security. Even more serious is the example of Hurricane Ivan, which struck Grenada. Grenada is an island deemed to be below and therefore outside of the hurricane belt according to Lloyd's marine insurance classifications. This one hurricane destroyed 90% of our homes, 80% of our crops, and delivered damages worth 200% of our GDP. Just to give you a sense of these impacts, Hurricane Katrina, as devastating as it was, produced damages worth only 2% of the GDP of the United States. Hurricane Sandy caused damages worth 0.5% of the GDP. In all cases, the poor are disproportionately impacted within the state or intranationally. But there is also an international dimension to this disparity of impacts, particularly for the small island developing states within the region, which is why we continue to call for a new metric for the assessing of concessional finance, one that looks at the vulnerabilities of the islands and goes beyond the mere measure of GDP. Mr. Chairman, development with social inclusion for the hemisphere must be underpinned by a focus not only on education, electronic communications, environment, but also the 4th E, energy. It is our view that sustainable energy for all is not only critical for addressing climate change and reducing poverty and inequality, but also represents an opportunity valued at $16 trillion for the competitiveness of the region and for growth and development with social inclusion. 2 days ago, the Grenada delegation attended the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, meeting in Abu Dhabi. This was also attended by many countries of this region. One of the main reports shows unequivocally that there is a high level of job creation using solar and wind energy and sustainable biofuels. Solar PV generation generated 2.3 million new jobs, almost doubling within 2 years. Liquid biofuels, 1.5 million jobs, and wind energy generated almost 1 million jobs globally. Renewables therefore represent a credible alternative and a sustainable development for social inclusion. For its part, Grenada is developing a smart island economy where development and social inclusion go hand in hand. This is underpinned by a knowledge economy where the international education sector already represents some 30% of Grenada's GDP. This sector contributes significantly to the quality education in Grenada and therefore development with social inclusion and through scholarships provided by St. George's University. We are developing a green economy that seeks to reduce our cost of electricity, which at 45 cents per kilowatt hour, while commensurate with the high costs in islands around the world, could be reduced further through more investment in renewable sources that will also create local jobs. And finally, Grenada is developing a blue economy that harnesses the wealth of the ocean environment with an exclusive economic zone measuring 26,000 square kilometers, as opposed to a landmass that is only 384 square kilometers. The government of Grenada has sought to ensure that the dialogue on realizing this process does not only remain in the political and policy area, but has sought to ensure that our citizenry are empowered in the process of nation building. To this end, the government of Grenada periodically facilitates consultations through a committee of social partners in a national social partners forum comprising of government, labor unions, private sector, churches, and civil society organizations. They meet monthly to engage as stakeholders in the aspirations of the greater shared prosperity as a nation. Indeed, an integral goal of the committee is the development of a social compact that would serve as a framework for a dialogue and a living testimony to my government's pledge of accountable governance. Mr. Chairman, the dialogue on development with social inclusion comes at a critical time when the relevance and the future of the Organization of American States has been questioned. The OAS Charter calls on members to eradicate extreme poverty as an obstacle to the full and democratic development of the peoples of the hemisphere. The Charter sees integral development as being essential to peace and security. Fittingly, some 22 articles out of a total of 52 articles of Part 1 of the Charter are devoted to integral development. We therefore welcome this year's theme as a moment of critical reflection for the organization and indeed the hemisphere as we, along with partner institutions and observer missions, contemplate that the integrity and the interdependence of the 4 pillars is a tightly knit package that must be preserved. Mr. Chairman, to ensure development and social inclusion, a new and reinvigorated OAS should play a catalytic role and use its convening power to galvanize political will around education, electronic communication, sustainable energy, and both the environmental threats and environmental bounty of the hemisphere. In bringing the socio-economic, political, and cultural diversity of the North, South, Central America, and the Caribbean, the OAS is uniquely positioned to play an integral role in promoting the fine-tuning of the development approach. The OAS must also play a role in complementing the traditional per capita income measures with a new, more nuanced perspective that addresses the structural gaps that constrain development. This calls for a review of the concept of development traditionally used to channel cooperation and resources. This calls for the adoption of a broader, multifaceted perspective which entails not just improving people's standards of living, but also achieving sustainable and inclusive growth, whereby the problems of social inequality can be addressed. Mr. Chairman, at the OAS, we cannot run from the future we fear, but we must now unite around a future that we can embrace. A future of growth and development with social inclusion. Above all, a future with shared prosperity for the generations to come. In this light, and in concluding, Grenada joins with our CARICOM colleagues in calling for the normalization of relations between our hemispheric partners, and notably Cuba and the United States. Grenada's partnership with both countries is important, and we add our voice to the calls of the participation of Cuba in the Summit of the Americas. Grenada also lends its support in the continued dialogue that has been requested by Argentina on its issues with the UK. Thank you, Mr. President. Que la amistad entre de los países crezca y que Dios bendiga a nuestros países.
Muchas gracias, señor ministro de Grenada, por su intervención. Ofrezco la palabra al último orador de la mañana, la representante de Surinam. Tiene usted la palabra.
President of the General Assembly, Secretary General of the OAS, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. On the occasion of this important gathering of the Organization of American States, I would like to take the opportunity on behalf of the government of the Republic of Suriname to thank the government and the people of Paraguay for hosting the 44th General Assembly of the OAS. On behalf of my delegation and myself, I would also like to express our sincere appreciation for the hospitality and the excellent arrangements made here in the beautiful city of Asunción. Mr. President, although the issue of development has prominently been placed on the regional and international agenda for many years, our meeting opens a new chapter for reflecting on the most appropriate approaches and strategies to further the social, economic, and intergenerational well-being of the peoples of the Americas. In this respect, the government of Suriname applauds the international endeavors for the establishment of the post-2015 Millennium Development Goals, as these will continue to shape an all-inclusive approach towards the attainment of social development. In light of the post-2015 development agenda and the findings of various studies by prominent institutions on the social panorama of our region, we are of the view that the theme of this year's General Assembly is timely and very appropriate. Suriname compliments the government of Paraguay for placing this theme before us to deliberate together as a region on how to address and find solutions for the causes and consequences of inequity and social exclusion. To this end, we are of the view that fostering just, inclusive, and sustainable social economic growth at all levels is a conditio sine qua non for development. Mr. President, we believe that economic development policies are essential for ensuring the realization of social developmental goals and priorities for the benefit of the people. Consequently, the government of Suriname underscores in its development policies and concurrent actions that the human being is at the center of all developmental activities. By focusing on policies for social inclusion, people can attain greater access to relevant social, economic, political, and cultural systems, which will reduce poverty levels and will also contribute to long-term development. From this perspective, social inclusions and policies that broaden income opportunities and the full participation of all groups in our society, including women and vulnerable groups, are deemed essential for ensuring sustainable development. Mr. President, in its developmental endeavors, my government is guided by the belief that human-centered development advances the creation of a just society by enabling a fair distribution of wealth and by investing in human capital. For the government of Suriname, investing in human capital implies investing in health, in education, housing, and in the security of the environment. In our view, a number of elements are indispensable for enabling social justice and social inclusion for development. Some of these are adapting prioritized sectors to changing circumstances on the world market, increasing productivity, enhancing competitiveness, spurring technological development and innovation, and creating employment opportunities. Mr. President, I wish to refer to the commitment of the President of my country to guarantee social inclusion and development for the people of Suriname by engaging into a social contract with the Surinamese people. With the social contract, President Bouterse has made a solemn pledge to ensure sustainable social economic development in several areas, such as housing, safe drinking water, healthcare, social protection, education, and youth development. For the implementation of such an all-encompassing social agenda, relevant budgetary measures, public policies, and laws have been put in place. This reflects the importance that my government attaches to combat social injustice and inequality with a specific focus on the most disadvantaged groups in our society. With respect to housing, we have embarked upon an elaborate social housing project aimed at providing decent and affordable housing for low-income groups, the elderly, persons with disabilities, and young families that are not in a position to acquire adequate housing without government assistance. In cooperation with the private sector, the government has established a specific housing construction fund to finance this project. Currently, efforts are underway to expand the housing project through the furthering of South-South cooperation and the fostering of public-private partnerships. With regard to healthcare, the government has adopted a robust national health sector plan for the period 2012 to 2016. Recently, the free basic healthcare services project has been launched, providing healthcare services free of charge for children between the ages 0 to 16 years and for persons of 60 years and older. In addition, a subsidized program was initiated targeting the improvement of nutritional health for newborn babies. We have also embarked upon an ambitious initiative for ensuring safe drinking water nationwide. For this purpose, relevant infrastructure and financial means have already been put in place. Within the context of the social economic development of my country, Suriname attaches great importance to invest in quality education and progressive development of the youth. In our view, improvement in education is essential to consolidate and propel the growth of the nation, to strengthen democratic institutions, and to promote development of the human potential. To achieve this, it is essential that education is available and accessible to all. In this regard, the government of Suriname has abolished tuition for primary education, making it universal and free of cost in my country. Notwithstanding an impressive literacy rate of approximately 90%, a specific policy plan for education for children has been put in place. Special mentioning has to be made of the early childhood development policy and programs that my government has been implementing. We have also embarked upon an after-school program which aims at providing children from disadvantaged groups after-school care in the form of homework assistance and meals. Mr. President, the multidimensional and cross-cutting nature of social inclusion is pivotal to the consolidation of democracy, the promotion and protection of human rights, in particular economic, social, and cultural rights, as well as guaranteeing citizen security. Without doubt, social equality and social security will be undermined if political stability, peace, security, and sustained economic growth are not adequately ensured. At the same, Mr. President, we recognize that achieving development with social inclusion is not without challenges. These challenges can be manifold and may entail, among others, institutional, financial, and public policy aspects. In the specific case of Suriname, a country with a low-lying coastal zone, the effects of climate change will pose enormous challenges to our developmental endeavors for guaranteeing social development. We also recognize that challenges could arise in relation to the creation of synergies in sub-regional, regional, and international cooperation with respect to projects and programs geared towards social development and social equality. In this respect, my government attaches great importance to the obligation of the OAS to prioritize the pillar of integral development, which, in our view, also reflects the commitment for social development and social inclusion through the very nature and characteristics of the various programs, policies, and mandates attached to this pillar. We believe that our organization has made important strides towards social development by formulating and/or adopting numerous standard-setting instruments, among which the Inter-American Democratic Charter, the Social Charter of the Americas, the Draft Plan of Action of the Social Charter, and other inter-American instruments on the promotion, protection, and observance of human rights. Mr. President, my government is in support of the reform efforts that are currently being undertaken within the context of the strategic vision of the OAS. We are of the view that the draft resolution on this matter creates a constructive platform for furthering the ongoing process towards efficiency and effectiveness of the work of our organization. We consider the draft Declaration of Asunción as a standard-setting document through which an explicit political commitment for ensuring equality and social inclusion for the people of the Americas will be expressed. Development with social inclusion, however, will require concerted actions at the national, sub-regional, regional, and international level. Against this backdrop, Suriname wishes to make an urgent call for stronger South-South cooperation, specifically among the Inter-American family of institutions as a complement to the OAS developmental agenda. In closing, the government of Suriname wishes to reiterate its ongoing commitment to the work of the OAS in general and to the developmental pillar in particular to ensure sustainable development for the OAS member states. I thank you.
Agradezco a la representante de Surinam por su intervención. Con este último orador hemos concluido la lista de oradores sobre el diálogo de jefes de delegación con relación al tema desarrollo con inclusión social. A los efectos de poder seguir nuestro orden del programa y teniendo en cuenta que para la 1 de la tarde, las 13 horas, tenemos un almuerzo de presentación del Índice de Progreso Social del Paraguay ofrecido a los jefes de delegación de los Estados miembros, al secretario general de la OEA, al secretario adjunto de la OEA, y con la presencia del señor presidente de la República, el señor Horacio Carter, propongo suspender aquí, hacer un cuarto intermedio de la sesión y regresar a las 3 de la tarde para proponer la aprobación de la declaración de asunción, dar oportunidad a los señores jefes de delegación que quieran referirse a la adopción de la declaración y continuar con la apertura de la cuarta plenaria y seguir con nuestra agenda al día. Si no encuentro ninguna objeción, así queda decidido.